Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. My name is Chris Bowick, and you're listening to the Lucid Learning Podcast. Lucid Learning is a podcast meant to be boring for people who have trouble sleeping. I'll be reading Wikipedia articles in a dry, boring voice. You may find some of these articles interesting, but I'll be changing topics constantly using the Wikipedia hyperlinks. I think it's fun to see where these hyperlinks take me throughout the show, and that's where the titles of the episodes come from. When I came up with this idea, I wanted to create a podcast for people to fall asleep to, and I thought, how can I make this boring on purpose? So the idea is that you will get bored of me talking about completely random topics. Don't forget to subscribe or follow this channel. I'll be posting weekly from now on. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel, where I also post these in a video format. If you search Lucid Learning Podcast, it's not a recording of me in a video. It's just, I know that some podcast apps have ads that are very loud. So if you're trying to listen to this while you're falling asleep, obviously those would wake you back up. And right now you can find me on a lot of different apps. I know Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, and a good bit more that I saw that I didn't even apply for. I guess they may just automatically go pull RSS feeds. If you have a topic you'd like to send in, you can email me at lucidlearningpodcast@gmail.com. And thank you for listening. We'll get right into it. Hello. So today I just happened to click on featured content on Wikipedia, and it brought up Cleopatra. So I think that's where we're going to start today and just see where it takes us. And so Cleopatra was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. Nominally survived as pharaoh by her son Caesarion. As a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, she was a descendant of its founder, Ptolemy Soter, a Macedonian Greek general, and companion of Alexander the Great. After the death of Cleopatra, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire, marking the end of the Hellenistic period that had lasted since the reign of Alexander. Her native language was Koine Greek, and she was the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the Egyptian language. In 58 BC, Cleopatra presumably accompanied her father, King Ptolemy XII, during his exile to Rome after a revolt in Egypt. After a revolt in Egypt allowed his daughter, Bernice IV, to claim the throne. Bernice was killed in 55 BC, when the king returned to Egypt with Roman military assistance. When he died in 51 BC, the joint reign of Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII began, but a falling out between them led to open civil war. After losing the 48 BC Battle of Pharsalus in Greece against his rival Julius Caesar, in Caesar's civil war, the Roman statesman Pompey fled to Egypt. Pompey had been a political ally of Ptolemy XII, but Ptolemy XIII, at the urging of his court eunuchs, had Pompey ambushed and killed before Caesar arrived and occupied Alexandria. Caesar then attempted to reconcile the rival Ptolemaic siblings, but Ptolemy's chief advisor, Pothanos, viewed Caesar's terms as favoring Cleopatra, so his forces besieged her and Caesar at the palace. Shortly after the siege was lifted by reinforcements, Ptolemy died in the 47 BC Battle of the Nile. His sister Arsinoe IV was eventually exiled to Ephesus for her role in carrying out the siege. Caesar declared Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIV joint rulers, but maintained a private affair with Cleopatra that produced Caesarion. Cleopatra traveled to Rome as a client queen in 46 and 44 BC, where she stayed at Caesar's villa. After the assassinations of Caesar and on her orders, Ptolemy the 14th in 44 BC, she named Caesarion co-ruler. In the Liberator's Civil War of 43 to 42 BC, Cleopatra sided with the Roman Second Triumvirate, formed by Caesar's grandnephew and heir, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. After their meeting at Tarsus in 41 BC, the queen had an affair with Antony. He carried out the execution of Arsinoe at her request and became increasingly reliant on Cleopatra for both funding and military aid during his invasions of the Parthian Empire and the Kingdom of Armenia. The donations of Alexandria declared her children Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene II, and Ptolemy Philadelphus rulers over various erstwhile territories under Antony's triumviral authority. This event, their marriage, and Antony's divorce of Octavian's sister, Octavia Minor, led to the final war of the Roman Republic. The final war, which is the last war of the Roman Republic, also known as Antony's Civil War, or the war between Antony and Octavian, was the last of the civil wars of the Roman Republic, fought between Mark Antony and Octavian. After the Roman Senate declared war on the Egyptian queen, Cleopatra, Antony, her lover and ally, betrayed the Roman government and joined the war on Cleopatra's side. After the decisive victory for Octavian at the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra and Antony withdrew to Alexandria, where Octavian besieged the city until both Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide. Following the end of the war, Octavian brought peace to the Roman state that had been plagued by a century of civil wars. Octavian became the most powerful man in the Roman world, and the Senate bestowed upon him the name of Augustus in 27 BC. Octavian, now Augustus, would be the first Roman emperor and would transform the oligarch republic into the autocratic Roman Empire. The last Republican Civil War would mark the beginning of Pax Romana, a period of relative internal peace and stability. Mark Antony was in Egypt with Cleopatra instead of his wife Octavia, who also happened to be Octavian's sister. Octavian was scheming to find a way to sever ties with Antony, start a war to crush him, kill a potential rival, Caesar and Cleopatra's son Caesarion, and take control of the entire Roman world. He did this by cleverly exposing Antony's will to the Senate, where he read out how Antony had left all his money to his children by Cleopatra, where they would reign as monarchs over kingdoms that he and Cleopatra would leave to them. Romans were scandalized by this type of behavior. Then Antony divorced Octavia to marry Cleopatra. Octavian, who later became the Emperor Augustus, convinced the Senate via a propaganda campaign to start a war against Cleopatra, since they were reluctant to declare war on Antony, as he was a true Roman and the last thing Octavian or the Senate needed was a mutiny. Eventually, Octavian chased Antony's senatorial supporters from Rome, and in 32 BC, the Roman Senate declared war against Cleopatra. By midsummer of 31 BC, Antony maneuvered his army into Greece, and Octavian soon followed. Octavian brought with him his chief military advisor and closest friend, Marcus Vespasianus Agrippa, to command his naval forces. Although the ground forces were comparable, Octavian's fleet was superior. Antony's fleet was made up of large vessels, but with inexperienced crews and commanders. Octavian's fleet of smaller, more maneuverable vessels was filled with experienced sailors. Octavian moved his soldiers across the Adriatic Sea to confront Antony near Actium. Meanwhile, Agrippa disrupted Antony's supply lines with the navy. Gaius Sosius commanded a squadron in Mark Antony's fleet, with which he managed to defeat the squadron of Lucius Arruntius and put it to flight. But when the latter was reinforced by Agrippa, Sosius's ally Tarquintimotius, the king of Cilicia, was killed, and Sosius himself was forced to flee. Octavian decided not to attack and risk unnecessary losses. Instead, Octavian wanted to battle Antony by sea, where his experienced sailors could dominate. In response, Antony and Octavian engaged in Fabian strategy until the time was right. As the summer ended and autumn began to set in, both Octavian and Antony settled for a battle of attrition. The strategy of delay paid dividends to Octavian, as morale sank and prominent Romans deserted Antony's cause. The first conflict of the war occurred when Octavian's general Agrippa captured the Greek city and naval port of Methone. The city had previously been loyal to Antony. Although Antony was an experienced soldier, he did not understand naval combat, which led to his downfall. Antony moved his fleet to Actium, where Octavian's navy and army had taken camp. In what would become known as the Battle of Actium, Antony, on September 2nd, 31 BC, moved his large quinqueremes through the strait and into the open sea. There, Octavian's light and maneuverable Liburnian ships drew in battle formation against Antony's warships. Cleopatra stayed behind Antony's line on her royal barge. A devastating blow to Antony's forces came when one of Antony's former generals delivered to Octavian Antony's battle plan. Antony had hoped to use his biggest ships to drive back Agrippa's wing on the north end of his line. But Octavian's entire fleet stayed carefully out of range. Shortly after midday, Antony was forced to extend his line out from the protection of the shore and then finally engage the enemy. Octavian's fleet, armed with better trained and fresher crews, made quick work of Antony's larger and less experienced navy. Octavian's soldiers had spent years fighting in Roman naval combat, where one objective was to ram the enemy ship and at the same time kill the above-deck crew with a shower of arrows and catapult launch stones large enough to decapitate a man. As the army stood on either side of the naval battle, they watched as Antony was being outmatched by Agrippa. Seeing that the battle was going against Antony, Cleopatra's fleet retreated to open sea without firing a shot, leaving Antony to fight for himself. As a gap opened in Agrippa's blockade, she funneled through and was soon closely followed by Antony's command ships. The commanders of Antony's large forces, or land forces, which were supposed to follow him to Asia, promptly surrendered their legions without a fight. Antony retreated to a smaller vessel with his flag and managed to escape to Alexandria. By the end of the day, Antony's entire fleet would lie at the bottom of the sea, and the Roman world had witnessed the largest naval battle in almost 200 years. Even though Octavian wanted to immediately pursue Antony and Cleopatra, many of his veterans wanted to retire and return to private life. Octavian allowed many of his longest-serving veterans, as many as 10 legions by some accounts, to retire. Many of these legionnaires could trace their service to Julius Caesar some 20 years earlier. After the winter ended, Octavian resumed the hunt. In the spring of 30 BC, Octavian rejected the idea of transporting his army across the sea and attacking Alexandria directly, and instead traveled by land through Asia. Antony had received much of his backing from Rome's client kingdoms in the east. By marching his army by land, he ensured Antony could not regroup and cement his authority over the provinces. Meanwhile, Antony attempted to secure an army in Cyrenaica from Lucius Pinarius. Unfortunately for Antony, Pinarius had switched his loyalty to Octavian. When Octavian received word of this development, he ordered Pinarius to move his 4 legions east towards Alexandria, while Octavian would move west. Trapped in Egypt with the remnant of their former army, Antony and Cleopatra bided their time awaiting Octavian's arrival. When Octavian and Pinarius arrived at Alexandria, they placed the entire city under siege. Before Octavian had arrived, Antony took the roughly 10,000 soldiers he had left and attacked Pinarius, unaware that he was outnumbered 2-1. Pinarius destroyed what was left of Antony's army, with Antony escaping back to Alexandria before Octavian arrived. As Octavian approached with his legions, what remained of Antony's cavalry and fleet surrendered to Octavian. Most of Antony's infantry surrendered without any engagement at this stage of the conflict, and Antony's cause was lost. Antony was forced to watch as his army in hopes of dominance in Rome were handed to Octavian. In honorable Roman tradition, Antony on August 1st, 30 BC, fell on his sword. According to the ancient accounts, however, he was not entirely successful, and with an open wound in his belly was taken to join Cleopatra, who had fled to her mausoleum. Here, Antony succumbed to his wound and supposedly died in his lover's arms, leaving her alone to face Octavian. Cleopatra did not immediately follow Antony in suicide. Instead, in a last-ditch effort, Cleopatra opened negotiations with Octavian. Cleopatra begged Octavian to spare Caesarion's life in exchange for willing imprisonment. Octavian refused. Within a week, Octavian informed Cleopatra that she was to play a role in Octavian's triumph back in Rome. This role was carefully explained to her, while Caesarion was butchered without compunction. Octavian supposedly said, "Two Caesars are one too many," as he ordered Caesarion's death. According to Strabo, who was alive at the time of the event, Cleopatra died from a self-induced bite from a venomous snake, or from applying a poisonous ointment to herself. Learning of Cleopatra's death, Octavian had mixed feelings. He admired the bravery of Cleopatra and gave her and Antony a public military funeral in Rome. As they left Alexandria, a new age dawned when Rome annexed Egypt. With Cleopatra's death, the final war of the Republic was over. Within a month, Octavian was named pharaoh, and Egypt became his personal possession. By executing Antony's supporters, Octavian finally brought a century of civil war to a close. In 27 BC, Octavian was named Augustus by the Senate and given unprecedented powers. Octavian, now Augustus, transformed the Republic into the Roman Empire, ruling it as the first emperor. So Julius Caesar wasn't an emperor of Rome then? If Octavian, is ruling as the first emperor? I just always assumed Caesar, the emperor, was an emperor. In the ensuing months and years, Augustus passed a series of laws that, while outwardly preserving the appearance of the Republic, made his position within it of paramount power and authority. He laid the foundations for what is now called the Roman Empire. From then on, the Roman state would be ruled by a princeps, first citizen, and I think princeps is where we get the word prince from, if I remember right. In modern terms, Rome would from now on be ruled by emperors. The Senate ostensibly still had power and authority over certain senatorial provinces, but the critical border provinces such as Syria, Egypt, and Gaul, requiring the greatest number of legions, would be directly ruled by Augustus and succeeding emperors. So basically, the Senate couldn't challenge him, right? He had the greatest number of legions. So if they tried to challenge him, that's who he controlled, was the army, basically. With the end of the last Republican Civil War, the Republic was replaced by the Empire. The reign of Augustus would usher in the golden era of Roman culture and produce a stability which Rome had not seen in over a century. With Roman control of the entire Mediterranean world, a peace would reign in the Roman world for centuries after the death of Augustus, the so-called Pax Romana, or Roman peace. The empire that Augustus established would last in Western Europe until the fall of Rome in the 5th century AD. The eastern part of the Roman Empire would also survive as the Byzantine Empire until the fall of Constantinople in AD 1453. The fall of Constantinople was the capture of the Byzantine Empire's capital by the Ottoman Empire. The fall of the city took place on 29 May 1453, the culmination of a 53-day siege, which had begun on 6 April 1453. The attacking Ottoman Empire, which significantly outnumbered Constantinople's defenders, was commanded by the 21-year-old Sultan Mehmed II, later called Mehmed the Conqueror, while the Byzantine Empire was led by Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos. After conquering the city, Sultan Mehmed made Constantinople the new Ottoman capital, replacing Adrianople. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, and effectively the end of the Roman Empire, a state which dated back to 27 BC, lasting nearly 1,500 years. The capture of Constantinople, a city which marked the divide between Europe and Asia Minor, also allowed the Ottomans to more effectively invade mainland Europe, eventually leading to Ottoman control of much of the Balkan Peninsula. The conquest of Constantinople and the fall of the Byzantine Empire was a key event of the late Middle Ages, which is sometimes considered the end of the medieval period. It was also a watershed moment in military history. Since ancient times, cities and castles had depended upon ramparts and walls to repel invaders. However, Constantinople's substantial fortifications were overcome with the use of gunpowder, specifically in the form of large cannons and bombards. Preparations for the final assault were started in the evening of 26 May and continued to the next day. For 36 hours after the War Council decision to attack, the Ottomans extensively mobilized their manpower in order to prepare for the general offensive. Prayer and resting would be then granted to the soldiers on the 28th, and then the final assault would be launched. On the Byzantine side, a small Venetian fleet of 12 ships, after having searched for Aegean, reached the capital on May 27th and reported to the emperor that no large Venetian relief fleet was on its way. On 28 May, as the Ottoman army prepared for the final assault, large-scale religious processions were held in the city. In the evening, a large solemn ceremony was held in the Hagia Sophia, in which the emperor and representatives of both the Latin and Greek church partook, together with nobility from both sides. Shortly after midnight, on May 29th, the all-out offensive began. The Christian troops of the Ottoman Empire attacked first, followed by the successive waves of the irregular Azabs, who were poorly trained and equipped, and Anatolians, who focused on a section of the Blacherne walls in the northwest part of the city, which had been damaged by the cannon. This section of the walls had been built earlier, in the 11th century, and was much weaker. The Anatolians managed to breach this section of walls and enter the city, but were just as quickly pushed back by the defenders. Finally, as the battle was continuing, the last wave, consisting of elite janissaries, attacked the city walls. The Genoese general in charge of the land troops, Giovanni Giustiniani, was grievously wounded during the attack, and his evacuation from the ramparts caused a panic in the ranks of the defenders. With Giovanni's Genoese troops retreating into the city and towards the harbor, Constantine and his men, now left to their own devices, kept fighting and managed to successfully hold off the Janissaries for a while, but eventually they could not stop them from entering the city. The defenders were also being overwhelmed at several points in Constantine's section. When Turkish flags were seen flying above a small postern gate, the Cleopatra, which was left open, panic ensued and the defense collapsed as Janissary soldiers led by Ulubati Hassan pressed forward. Many Greek soldiers ran back home to protect their families. The Venetians ran over to their ships, and a few of the Genoese got over to Galata. The rest committed suicide by jumping off the city walls or surrendered. The Greek houses nearest to the walls were the first to suffer from the Ottomans. It is said that Constantine, throwing aside his purple regalia, led the final charge against the incoming Ottomans, perishing in the ensuing battle in the streets just like his soldiers. On the other hand, Niccolo Barbaro, a Venetian eyewitness to the siege, wrote in his diary that it was said that Constantine hanged himself at the moment when the Turks broke in at the San Romano gate, although his ultimate fate remains unknown. After the initial assault, the Ottoman army fanned out along the main thoroughfare of the city, the Messi, past the great forums and past the Church of the Holy Apostles, which Mehmed II wanted to provide a seat for his newly appointed patriarch, which would help him better control his Christian subjects. Mehmed had sent an advance guard to protect key buildings such as the Church of the Holy Apostles. A small few lucky civilians managed to escape. When the Venetians retreated over to their ships, the Ottomans had already taken the walls of the Golden Horn. Luckily for the occupants of the city, the Ottomans were not interested in killing potentially valuable slaves, but rather in the loot they could get from raiding the city's houses, so they decided to attack the city instead. The Venetian captain ordered his men to break open the gate of the Golden Horn. Having done so, the Venetians left in ships filled with soldiers and refugees. Shortly after the Venetians left, a few Genoese ships, and even the emperor's ships followed them out of the Golden Horn. This fleet narrowly escaped prior to the Ottoman navy assuming control over the Golden Horn, which was accomplished by midday. The army converged upon the Augusteum, the vast square that fronted the great church of Hagia Sophia, whose bronze gates were barred by a huge throng of civilians inside the building, hoping for divine protection. After the doors were breached, the troops separated the congregation according to what price they might bring in the slave markets. Ottoman casualties are unknown, but they are believed by most historians to be very heavy due to several unsuccessful Ottoman attacks made during the siege and final assault. According to the Venetian surgeon Niccolo Barbaro, blood flowed in the city, quote, like rainwater in the gutters after a sudden storm. And bodies of Turks and Christians floating in the sea like melons along a canal. Ugh. Mehmed II granted his soldiers 3 days to plunder the city, as he had promised them and in accordance with the custom of the time. Soldiers fought over the possession of some of the spoils of war. Most of the Greek women were raped and enslaved. According to the Venetian surgeon Niccolo Barbaro, all through the day the Turks made a great slaughter of Christians through the city. According to Philip Menzel, widespread persecution of the city's civilian inhabitants took place, resulting in thousands of murders and rapes and 33,000 civilians being enslaved or forcibly deported. The looting was extremely thorough in certain parts of the city. 4 days later, on 2nd June, the Sultan would find the city largely deserted and half in ruins. Churches had been desecrated and stripped, houses were no longer habitable, and stores and shops were emptied. He is famously reported to have been moved to tears by this, speaking, "What a city we have given over to plunder and destruction." On the 3rd day of the conquest, Mehmed II ordered all looting to stop and issued a proclamation that all Christians who had avoided capture or who had been ransomed could return to their homes without further molestation, although many had no homes to return to, and many more had been taken captive and not ransomed. Byzantine historian George Sfrences, an eyewitness to the fall of Constantinople, described the Sultan's actions. And he quotes, "On the 3rd day after the fall of our city, the Sultan celebrated his victory with a great joyful triumph. He issued a proclamation. The citizens of all ages who had managed to escape detection were to leave their hiding places throughout the city and come out into the open, as they were to remain free and no question would be asked. He further declared the restoration of houses and property to those who had abandoned our city before the siege. If they returned home, they would be treated according to their rank and religion as if nothing had changed. The Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, but the Greek Orthodox Church was allowed to remain intact, and Gennadius Scholarius was appointed Patriarch of Constantinople. This was once thought to be the origin of the Ottoman millet system. However, it is now considered a myth, and no such system existed in the 15th century. The fall of Constantinople shocked many Europeans, who viewed it as a catastrophic event for their civilization. Many feared other European Christian kingdoms would suffer the same fate as Constantinople. Two possible responses emerged among the humanists and the church of that era: crusade or dialogue. Pope Pius II strongly advocated for another crusade, while the German Nicholas of Cusa supported engaging in a dialogue with the Ottomans. Renaissance humanism was a revival in the study of classical antiquity, at first in Italy and then spreading across Western Europe in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. Contemporary use of the term humanism is consistent with the historical use prominent in that period, while Renaissance humanism is a retronym used to distinguish it from later humanist developments. Renaissance humanism was a response to what came to be depicted by later Whig historians as the narrow pedantry associated with medieval scholasticism. Humanists sought to create a citizenry able to speak and write with eloquence and clarity, and thus capable of gauging in the civic life of their communities and persuading others to virtuous and prudent actions. This was to be accomplished through the study of the Studia Humanitatis, today known as the humanities: grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy. Humanism was a pervasive culture mode and not the program of a small elite, a program to revive the cultural legacy, literary legacy, and moral philosophy of classical antiquity. There were important centers of humanism in Florence, Naples, Rome, Venice, Genoa, Mantua, Ferrara, and Urbino. The Renaissance humanism also awoke in man a love of learning and, quote, a true love for books, where humanists built book collections and university libraries developed. Humanists believed that the individual encompassed body, mind, and soul, and learning was very much a part of edifying all aspects of the human. This love of and for learning would lead to a demand in the printed word, which in turn drove the invention of Gutenberg's printing press. Ethics, or moral philosophy, is a branch of philosophy that involves systematizing, defending, and recommending concepts of right and wrong conduct. The field of ethics, along with aesthetics, concerns matters of value and thus compromises the branch of philosophy called axiology. Ethics seeks to resolve questions of human morality by defining concepts such as good and evil, right and wrong, virtue and vice, justice and crime. As a field of intellectual inquiry, moral philosophy also is related to the fields of moral psychology, descriptive ethics, and value theory. Metaethics is the branch of philosophical ethics that asks how we understand, know about, and what we mean when we talk about what is right and what is wrong. An ethical question pertaining to a particular practical solution, such as, should I eat this particular piece of chocolate cake, cannot be a meta-ethical question. Rather, this is an applied ethical question. A meta-ethical question is abstract and relates to a wide range of more specific practical questions. For example, is it ever possible to have secure knowledge of what is right and wrong is a meta-ethical question. Metaethics has always accompanied philosophical ethics. For example, Aristotle implies that less precise knowledge is possible in ethics than in other spheres of inquiry, and he regards ethical knowledge as depending upon habit and acculturation in a way that makes it distinctive from other kinds of knowledge. An acculturation is a process of social, psychological, and cultural change that stems from the balancing of two cultures while adapting to the prevailing culture of the society. So it's kind of like acclimating, I would assume. It's a process in which an individual adopts, acquires, and adjusts to a new cultural environment. Yeah. Metaethics is also important in G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica from 1903. In it, he wrote about what he called the naturalistic fallacy. Moore was seen to reject naturalism in ethics in his open question argument. This made thinkers look again at second-order questions about ethics. Earlier, the Scottish philosopher David Hume had put forward a similar view on the difference between facts and values. So, in philosophical ethics, naturalistic fallacy was introduced by G.E. Moore. Moore argues it would be fallacious to explain that which is good reductively in terms of natural properties such as pleasant and desirable. Moore's naturalistic fallacy is closely related to the is-ought problem, which comes from David Hume's A Treatise of Human Nature. However, unlike Hume's view of the is-ought problem, Moore did not consider the naturalistic fallacy to be at odds with moral realism. The naturalistic fallacy should not be confused with the appeal to nature fallacy, which is exemplified by forms of reasoning such as something is natural, therefore it is morally acceptable, or this property is unnatural, therefore this property is undesirable. Such inferences are common in discussions of medicine, sexuality, environmentalism, gender roles, race, and carnism. So the is-ought problem, in using his categorical imperative, Kant deduced that experience was necessary for their application, but experience on its own, or the imperative on its own, could not possibly identify an act as being moral or immoral. We can have no certain knowledge of morality from them, being incapable of deducing how things ought to be from the fact that they happen to be arranged in a particular manner in experience. Bentham, in discussing the relations of law and morality, found that when people discuss problems and issues, they talk about how they wish it would be as opposed to how it actually is. This can be seen in discussions of natural law and positive law. Bentham criticized natural law theory because in his view it was a naturalistic fallacy, claiming that it described how things ought to be instead of how they are. So that's where the is-ought title comes from. According to G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica, when philosophers try to define good reductively in terms of natural properties like pleasant or desirable, they are committing the naturalistic fallacy. This is a quote from Arthur N. Pryor. The assumption that because some quality or combination of qualities invariably and necessarily accompanies the quality of goodness, or is invariably and necessarily accompanied by it, or both, this quality or combination of qualities is identical with goodness. If, for example, it is believed that whatever is pleasant is and must be good, or that whatever is good is and must be pleasant, or both, it is committing the naturalistic fallacy to infer from this that goodness and pleasantness are one and the same quality. The naturalistic fallacy is the assumption that because the words good and, say, pleasant necessarily describe the same object, they must attribute the same quality to them. In defense of ethical non-naturalism, Moore's argument is concerned with the semantic and metaphysical underpinnings of ethics. In general, opponents of ethical naturalism reject ethical conclusions drawn from natural facts. Moore argues that good, in the sense of intrinsic value, is simply ineffable. It cannot be defined because it is not a natural property, being one of those innumerable objects of thought which are themselves incapable of definition, because they are ultimate terms by reference to which whatever is capable of definition must be defined. On the other hand, ethical naturalists eschew such principles in favor of a more empirically accessible analysis of what it means to be good. For example, in terms of pleasure in the context of hedonism. And G.E. Moore is quoted from his book, Principia Ethica, that pleased does not mean having the sensation of red or anything else, whatever, does not prevent us from understanding what it does mean. It is enough for us to know that pleased does mean having the sensation of pleasure. And though pleasure is absolutely indefinable, though pleasure is pleasure and nothing else whatever, yet we feel no difficulty in saying that we are pleased. The reason is, of course, that when I say I am pleased, I do not mean that I am the same things as having pleasure. And similarly, no difficulty need be found in my saying that pleasure is good, and yet no meaning that pleasure is the same thing as good, that pleasure means good, and that good means pleasure. If I were to imagine that when I said I am pleased, I meant that I was exactly the same thing as pleased, I should not indeed call that a naturalistic fallacy, although it would be the same fallacy as I have called naturalistic with reference to ethics. It looks like, I guess that's chapter 7, Moore argues that a property is either a complex of simple properties, or else it is irreducibly simple. Complex properties can be defined in terms of their constituent parts, but a simple property has no parts. In addition to good and pleasure, Moore suggests that the color qualia are undefined. If one wants to understand yellow, one must see examples of it. It will do no good to read the dictionary and learn that yellow names the color of egg yolks and ripe lemons, or that yellow names the primary color between green and orange on the spectrum, or that the perception of yellow is stimulated by electromagnetic radiation with a wavelength of between 570 and 590 nanometers, because yellow is all that more by the open question argument. Bernard Williams called Moore's use of the naturalistic fallacy a spectacular misnomer, the question being metaphysical as opposed to rational. So the open question argument is a philosophical argument that put forward by British philosopher G.E. Moore to refute the equating of the property of goodness with some non-moral property X, whether natural or supernatural. That is, Moore's argument attempts to show that no moral property is identical to a natural property. The argument takes the form of a syllogism modus tollens. So premise 1, if X is good, then the question, is it true that X is good, is meaningless. Premise 2, the question, is it true that X is good, is not meaningless, because it's an open question. Conclusion, X is not analytically equivalent to good. The type of question Moore refers to in this argument is an identity question. Is it true that X is Y? Such a question is an open question if a conceptually competent speaker can question this. Otherwise, it is closed. For example, I know he is a vegan, but does he eat meat? Would be a closed question. However, I know that it is pleasurable, but is it good? Is an open question. The answer cannot be derived from the meaning of the terms alone. The open question argument claims that any attempt to identify morality with some set of observable natural properties will always be liable to an open question, and that if this is true, then moral facts cannot be reduced to natural properties, and that therefore ethical naturalism is false. Put another way, Moore is saying that any attempt to define good in terms of a natural property fails because such definitions can be transformed into closed questions. the subject and predicate being conceptually identical, that is, the two terms mean the same thing. However, all purported naturalistic definitions of good are transformable into open questions, for it can still be questioned whether good is the same thing as pleasure. Shortly before, Moore had said, if good is defined as pleasure or any other natural property, good may be substituted for pleasure or any other property anywhere where it occurs. However, pleasure is good is a meaningful, informative statement, but good is good is an uninformative tautology. So it seems like these philosophers, or at least this guy, is just arguing semantics to me. I mean, I'm sure it has a deeper meaning that I just don't understand. But it sounds like it's just semantics. Talking about definitions, and it's just kind of, I don't know. I'm probably wrong. The idea that Moore begs the question assumes the conclusion in a premise was first raised by W. Frankina. Since analytic equivalency for two objects x and y logically results in the question, is it true that x is y, being meaningless by Moore's argument, to say that the question is meaningless is to concede analytic equivalency. Thus Moore begs the question in the second premise. He assumes that the question is a meaningful one, i.e. that it is an open question. This begs the question, and the open question argument thus fails. In response to this, the open question argument can be reformulated. The Darwall-Gibbard-Railton reformulation argues for the impossibility of equating a moral property with a non-moral one using the internalist theory of motivation. This evidently presupposes the internalist theory of motivation, i.e. a belief can itself motivate. In contrast to the externalist theory of motivation, also known as the Humean theory of motivation, both a belief and a desire are required to motivate. If internalism is true, then the OQA avoids begging the question against the naturalist and succeeds in showing that the good cannot be equated to some other property. The argument is also contested on the grounds of the supremacy of internalism. Internalism is supported by the belief-desire-intention model of motivation, whereby desire that some proposition ought to be made or kept true, and belief that some proposition is true, combine to form intention, and thereby action. To argue for the special motivational effects of moral beliefs is to commit the fallacy of special pleading. Special pleading is an informal fallacy wherein one cites something as an exception to a general or universal principle without justifying the special exception. This is the application of a double standard. In the classic distinction among material fallacies, cognitive fallacies, and formal fallacies, special pleading most likely falls within the category of a cognitive fallacy, as it would seem to relate to lip service. Lip service is... Oh, there's no link to it. Let me see. Promising but empty talk. Oh, so it's like slang. Kind of right. Yeah, slang is... Oh, never mind. The slang is cunnilingus, so I'm gonna delete this. I can't believe I just did that. Alright, I'm gonna go back then. So some examples of special pleading is unexplained claims of exemption from principles commonly thought relevant to the subject matter. So the example is, I'm not relying on faith in small probabilities here. These are slot machines, not roulette wheels. They're different. Another is claims to data that are inherently unverifiable, perhaps because too remote or impossible to define clearly. The inhabitants of the third planet of the Alpha Centauri system believe in God. So, yeah, there's no way to prove that because you can't go there and you just don't know. And then this example is, you aren't like me, so you do not even have a right to think about or hold opinions on my plight. So yeah, it's... What is this? Special pleading fallacy. So I'm going to click on the "you aren't like me, so you don't have a right to think about or hold opinions on my plight." It has its own link. And it's the association fallacy. It's an informal, inductive fallacy of the hasty generalization or red herring type in which asserts by irrelevant association and often by appeal to emotion that qualities of one thing are inherently qualities of another. That qualities of one thing are inherently qualities of another. Two types of association fallacies are sometimes referred to as guilt by association and honor by association. So, some examples. John is a con artist. John has black hair. Therefore, all people with black hair are con artists. Lyle is a crooked salesman. Lyle proposes monorail. Therefore, monorail is folly. So it sounds like the way that a lot of, I guess, politicians work, you know? I could definitely see that. Well, I'm not going to get political, so I feel like this is a good time to go ahead and end this episode. Oh, man. This was a pretty good one. I feel like we went pretty deep. I always seem to come back to, like, ethics somehow, like philosophical questions, ethics, fallacies. I started with Cleopatra, so it's not, of course, weird that I went to the fall of Rome, because she's kind of part of it. So, well, she's not part of the fall of Rome, but, you know, she was involved with the Roman Empire starting to begin with. So I'm going to go ahead and end it here. If you liked this episode, please go ahead and like or subscribe or review this episode, whichever is relevant to your medium. Follow me on Twitter at lucidlearning_, because lucid learning was taken. If you want to listen to a specific topic, go ahead and shoot me an email at lucidlearningpodcast@gmail.com. Also, go ahead and donate to Wikipedia too if you can. It's a great resource that everyone can access for free. There's no ads. I think they live on donations. Thank you for listening to the Lucid Learning Podcast. My name is Chris Bowick, and good night.